Good day, my name is Ingrid Schudel and I'm from the Environmental Learning Research Centre, Rhodes University. I'd like to invite you to think about transformative learning in climate change education. To do this, I'm going to work with a number of principles identified by UNESCO for responding to the issues around climate change. And also I'm going to work with the idea of dialectics using a critical realist's dialectical process model for environmental learning. The context in which I will do this and explore this is in two rural primary school classrooms in the Eastern Cape. So the themes that the two cases that I'm going to share with you focus on, you will see there's both a focus on food security and water security. And you will see that these link very strongly to the UNESCO interest in climate change. Firstly, if we take a look at that quote, you'll see that the UNESCO has made a commitment to sustainable development, but also highlighted that the adverse effects of climate change have very serious humanitarian implications and consequences, and they want this highlighted in responses to climate change. They've also highlighted a number of themes that link to climate change. So amongst many, the two we're focusing on are food insecurity and water insecurity. Both are tied up very strongly with concerns around climate change. Then this particular quote comes from a declaration of ethical principles in relation to climate change. And this declaration sets out 6 ethical principles. Firstly, prevention of harm, precautionary approach, equity and justice, sustainable development, solidarity, and scientific knowledge and integrity. But before we go into the cases, let's look at the question of why I'm using dialectics. Well, first of all, climate change education has an interest in highlighting adaptation and mitigation. And both of these require an interest in social ecological change. And there are questions such as what should change, who should change, what change is good, and what enables and constrains change. So dialectic is an explanation of the movement and of the transformation of things. So you can see that it might be a useful thinking tool for helping us to explain social ecological change. The particular dialectic that I'm using is inspired by Roy Bhaskar, and it is a critical realist dialectic. And so it's from this that I have developed a dialectical process model of environmental learning for use in education for sustainable development and also in climate change education. So to look a little bit more at this process model, I start with the first level of the dialectic, which is just simply looking at and describing what is the nature of the world. Although it's not necessarily that simple, because it also tries to identify potential contradictions or absences in the world. And these are really ills or worries or oppressive relations in the world that need to be highlighted. Once we have a good understanding of the world that we are living in, then we need to think about how we can absent these absences that we have identified in the first stage. And not only are we looking at absenting them, but we're looking for unrealized possibilities, as yet unrealized possibilities that can potentially be mobilized. So to realize that the world that we're looking at isn't the entire world. There are other potentials, there are other ways of doing, there are other ways of being. And those are quite important to uncover in our work. Then we also need to think about, well, there are many ways we can move in the world, many changes, many alternatives to the world that we live in. But the question is, are we looking at these alternatives holistically, including the whole of totality, as Roy Bhaskar calls it? And are we identifying any false totalities or making any compromises in the particular choices that we make in the alternatives that we choose? And then once we have considered all of these things, then we can move into the idea of what Bhaskar calls transformative praxis. And that is where we use our understanding of the nature of the world to find something that's practically possible to do, and also to look for possibilities that we didn't necessarily think we were there. We also need to think about possibilities that are morally defensible. And then the final addition that is made at this level is changes in context. So we need to be able to make changes that are relevant to particular people in particular places and in particular time. And they need to be reasonable from all of the perspectives that we have highlighted at the lower levels. So a reminder that this is a dialectical process model, and it is a critical realist dialectical process model. So now moving a little bit more into the context of the rural Eastern Cape, and this is where the 2 case studies were done. And in the Eastern Cape at the time, which was in 2013, we were experiencing high levels of unemployment and financial insecurity. There was unhealthy and degraded soil, and they were experiencing a drought. Children had irregular access to meals from home, and the meals that they did have were not as nutritious as they should be. And all of this is in the context of the South African Bill of Rights, which would prefer otherwise for the citizens of South Africa and the children of South Africa. And the South African Bill of Rights insists on the right of access to food. So how is this possible in this very bleak picture that is painted here? And you can also see a struggling garden on the right-hand side where there are little dots of spinach attempting to be grown. And this context hasn't changed much in the time since this study was done. The other important context to consider is the educational context. We have a wonderful curriculum to work with, which insists on the principle of human rights, inclusivity, and environmental and social justice. And it also calls for encouraging an active and critical approach to learning, rather than rote and uncritical learning of given truths. So you can see a curriculum that is committed to change. But we are battling with poor educational governance and mismanagement of the school feeding scheme, ill health amongst learners, which contributes to an inability to concentrate in school and obviously then affecting access to schooling. And another interesting context at the time was this expected pastoral role to be played by educators. And the teachers were taking on this particular role because they were faced with hungry, ill, struggling children in their classrooms. And so they embraced, all of the teachers that I worked with, embraced this pastoral role, which was suggested by the Department of Education for teachers. So let's now go into a little bit of detail around the cases. So these were 2 cases in foundation phase classrooms, and both of them the teachers were teaching about nutrition. So let's look at the first part of the dialectic. The world, understanding the world into which we're thrown. On the right-hand side, you've got a picture taken by the teacher where she took a picture of her struggling garden, and she brought it to the learners to ask them how they could improve the situation in their garden. You'll see she was also using it as an opportunity for language learning, where she's got the Xhosa as well as the English names of the vegetables. Then she did a very creative audit looking at what breakfast the children had eaten during the course of the week. And she helped them because they were young learners, and so she developed specific colors for different breakfasts. So you'll see some of them had Weet Bix, some of them had rice. You can't really see, but the different colors represent different breakfast foods. But what was worrying from her audit was that there are a couple of purple circles there which say Andi Changa, and that means we did not eat. And so what we have here is the teacher inadvertently identifying a situation where 3 learners in her classroom were not getting a regular breakfast when they come to school. And then in a second case, the other teacher focused on teaching about the food pyramid, a standard topic covered in the foundation phase, and also getting the learners to develop menus to represent a healthy meal using all the food groups. And then she did an audit, another very creative audit, where she actually designed the audit. These learners were a little bit older, so they were able to read and rehearse the audit that she had designed, and they all took them home and they simply had to do a tick against each answer. So this was quite sophisticated for a foundation phase classroom. And then from that, she developed a graph comparing the eating habits of the different families and found some very worrying things, such as out of the 23 learners, there were 13 of them who ate a meal twice a day or less. There were 15 who ate no breakfast at all, and 3 who only ate breakfast on the weekends. And then there were 7 learners who had 3 or more food groups per meal, but then there was 6 of the learners that had only 1 food group per meal. So this was identifying some interesting problems around healthy eating in their homes. So this, if we now go back to those principles of climate change education that I introduced, shows a very close link to scientific knowledge and integrity, which is what they call for. And they say that this should be both in the sciences and in the social sciences, that our decision making should be based on these. And in the classrooms, you could see the children were getting a good education around this. They had some strong mathematics that was being developed in the auditing activities, which underpinned a very strong social science as a way of exploring people and groups and their food eating habits. Life skills, the subject, was also strengthened through learning about what plants and humans need to stay healthy. And so this was also underpinned by a strong science. Let's now move on to the next aspect of the dialectic. And this one is looking at unrealized possibilities that we can potentially mobilize. And so what the one teacher did was to take the children to see a community garden close to the school. And there they saw very successful vegetables, they saw mulching, they saw how well the garden was looked after and regularly watered. She was also a very good gardener herself, and so she brought a whole lot of vegetables, some from her own garden, to stimulate discussion in the classroom with the learners. So these teachers were looking at absenting ills that they had identified in their community at a number of levels. The first level was at the school level, where they were thinking about a food garden to supplement the school feeding scheme, and importantly, integrating that with the school curriculum. I'll explain why it was so important later. They were also looking at ecosystems and soil health, and, for example, looking at mulching to improve capacity to grow plants. They also looked at social structures because, having identified children who were not eating, there was the possibility of organizing social grants to respond to the lack of finances for feeding the children in the homes. And they also considered the personal level, where they talked about teaching the children about lunchbox choices to address poor nutrition. So this links to the principles 1, 3, and 5 from the UNESCO climate change principles. And so the one is the prevention of harm. And you can see how a focus on healthy lunchboxes and healthy ecosystems is preventing harm both to human and the surrounding environment. It also focused on equity and justice. So, for example, the importance of children being able to access food and having healthy food. So this was addressed through the idea of supplementing the school feeding scheme. And then solidarity, where a teacher who took on that pastoral role and took on the role of working with families in order to organize social grants. So you can see those principles coming through. Then we have the next consideration where we start to talk about the holistic picture in a little bit more detail. So this is level 3 of the dialectic. So what you have here is the teacher on the left who actually went back to the children's rights, and you can't really read it there, but she was looking for things that were pertinent to her work, and this document highlighted the importance of children having access to food and education. And of course, we know that not good access to food affects one's ability to actually have a meaningful education, concentration, attendance, etc. Then the other teacher also took on the principle around human rights, social justice, inclusivity, healthy environment, and she wrote her own story to share with the learners about how they might, or playing out a story that might be of relevance to them or might have resonance with them in their own lives. And so the story talked about a hungry child and the mother who was struggling to support the child and how she was working. And so this brought the issues close to the learners. So further around this question of the holistic picture, the importance of holism, the one teacher highlighted Nomonde, she asked to be named, highlighted that and discussed this idea around healthy lunchboxes. But she said they don't bring lunchboxes. They depend on this feeding scheme. But at home they have not improved, because it is the parents. It is about money. It has not improved. Theoretically, they know. So she's highlighting a very important problem that was coming up in these classrooms with the curriculum and what they learn in school being the ideal around healthy eating, but this being impossible in practice due to socioeconomic circumstances. And then another teacher had something very interesting to say, Nomhle. And Nomhle said, I am not teaching the children to become farm workers. And this was very important to her because it was around the question of whether the children should be growing their own food in school or should they be learning. And she was very adamant that she had a different vision for these children, who most of whom had parents who were farm workers. She had a different vision for them. She was using the garden not to perpetuate their circumstances, but in order to improve their education. And you can see how there were some very interesting mathematics activities going on, some very interesting language activities going on. So this teacher was using the gardens in an important way, in a creative way, in an educational way. So this raised questions such as, or all of these activities raised questions such as, what is the role of teachers in schools? Should they be expected to take on this pastoral role? Should children in school grow their own food? Should structural problems such as failing feeding schemes, failing social grants, or difficulty of accessing social grants be addressed? Or is the activity of of organizing and achieving the social grants sufficient? So some interesting questions came up there. So now we move on to the final aspect of the dialectic, which is about transformative praxis. So this possibility of what we can actually do in context. So in case one, the children and teachers managed to plant a vegetable garden at school, and they managed to supplement the school feeding scheme. The teacher managed to organize social grants for those 3 children. That was the first case that I showed you. And those children had the choice, those children that did have the choice responded by packing different food in their lunch boxes. So there were some in the class that did have that luxury of choice. Then in case 2, the teacher had a much more difficult time. Her garden, the soil she was trying to use for the garden was much more difficult to work for various reasons. She also had a problem with members of the community coming in and taking the vegetables when they weren't watched. And so she had to go right back to the beginning and gain the community support, firstly in protecting their garden. So they did manage to plant a vegetable garden at school, but the vegetables were stunted because of the drought. She tried then to organize a tractor also because of the compacted soil, and the tractor broke down. So she had these ongoing challenges that mitigated against her being able to get a successful garden. She made attempts at mulching. She also organized for a local farmer to bring ostrich dung to try and enrich the soil. So she really put a lot of effort in at that basic level. Additionally, because of the drought, there was a scarcity of water, and they did have rain tanks, but they were specifically set aside for the children to drink because the water was not always easily accessible. So you can see 2 similar situations, but and fairly close to each other, these 2 schools, but the one teacher just facing too many challenges on top of each other. So this then links to the other climate change principle around sustainable development. And you can see how sustainable development, which is that top level, is a big challenge, is not necessarily easy to access, and also has challenges beyond the surface level, beyond the level of simply planting a garden, but it has to do with social, ecological challenges and difficulties that are going to enable or constrain these particular changes. So just to remind you then that we have this is the dialectical process model, and you will see that I have adapted it to make it a little bit more accessible in terms of the 4 different levels, or to simplify the 4 different levels to be what is and what is not in our world, what could be, so exploring those new possibilities, what should be, which is where we start weighing up different challenges and considering totality, and then what can be. So what can be is is that really difficult part at the end where we have to implement our ideals. So those are 4 different knowledge interests in the dialectic. And then also you will see that the actions in the dialectic both emerge from each other. You'll see the little arrows going up. Each one sort of depends on a little bit of understanding at the bottom level, but also they can act back on each other. So, for example, what can be, if the teacher manages to succeed with her mulching project, she can affect what is and what is not, because she can make a richer and healthier soil. If the teacher manages to address the problem of access to social grants. She is having an impact in the community in terms of social structures, etc. So this is what we call emergence in the dialectic, that relationship between different levels emerging from each other and also acting back. However, you don't necessarily, if you want to sort of use this to influence your teaching, you don't necessarily have to start with the questions of what is and what is not. You can start with what can be. You can start with lovely explorations of sustainability practices. And so you can move around this model in your teaching and in your design of teaching. So what are the implications of these cases and this model for transformative climate change education? So this model possesses powers for being critical, as our curriculum wants us to be, but without prescription. You could see there's a lot of exploration and unexpected things that happened through these activities. You can create new visions, but those visions are not highly idealistic or unrealistic. They are based on possibility. You will see that some of the initial ideals had to be dropped. For example, the one teacher with the lunch boxes. But she and the children learnt a lot through this activity. And so these visions always had to be brought back to reality. The model also helps us to think about totality and to offer a holistic perspective on change, and also a grounded and contextualized practice that works for particular people in particular places, in particular times, in particular circumstances. A few further thoughts. The model enables strengthening of rationality. So, in other words, particularly the social sciences and the sciences, helping us to understand the world, but also the model helps us to think about the not yet seen, yet unimagined possibilities, or possibilities that have not yet been mobilized. It also strengthens not only rationality, but also wisdom, which is, for example, supported by where you see this idea of weighing up of options and finding new ways of doing and the best way of doing something. And Bhaskar says that these are both necessary, both rationality and wisdom are necessary to support the realization of one's ideas in practice. He also says that to achieve true freedom, we need self-determination and autonomy. And this is now an interesting question for these young learners in these primary school classrooms. How much self-determination and autonomy can we expect amongst these young learners? You'll see that a lot was driven by the teachers. And Shipway makes an interesting commentary on this for young learners, is that he sees teachers as the custodians of students' emancipation. So we've got a very active and important role for teachers in guiding and supporting the learners here. Finally, I've left you with a few references that you can look at in your own time. Thank you very much for your attention.